I think we should start with our top story, which is the report out against, the issue of violence against women and girls. The report says that despite spending, outcomes have got worse. And this is the thing that I found absolutely shocking. I suspect our viewers will too. It turns out that the Home Office has, and this is both under Labour and Conservative governments, historically underspent its own budget on the violence against women and girls strategy by an average of 15%. I mean, how can you conceivably take it seriously if you're not allocating the resources? I mean, you were in government, Caroline. What's going on?
Well, I mean, that is not a good headline, is it? 15% of resources for this really important area of work isn't being spent. But I think it's also about how the sort of different parts, whether it's the policing and others, is just not joined up enough. And I think 4 years ago there was a re-look at this. Obviously, the terrible death of Sarah Everard, I mean, that was a police officer involved in that, but other women as well, that it seems that instead of moving forward, we're actually going backwards. I think it's something like 1 in 12 women experience some form of violence, whether it's domestic violence, rape or other serious offences. And it's a massive problem. And part of it is about resources, Rob, you're right. Yep. But I think part of it is just not taking these things seriously, not listening. We've got enough laws on this. We've got laws being produced every other week on upskirting, coercion, and they're important. But if at the end of the day the outcomes aren't making a difference, we have to really look seriously. But I would say as well, and I think we probably agree on this, Salma, there is a bigger issue about the access to really violent pornography on the internet, and just what our boys and young people, girls, are being brought up to think is normal, and it isn't normal.
It is terrifying. And when you look at some of the details that are listed, that, you know, boys as young as 7 and 8 are seeing this being shared on phones and like. But it's hard to know how you put the genie back in that bottle. I mean, that is the big problem, isn't it? With tackling all of the problems we have with things being shared.
Just to go back to the report for a second, I think one of the things that it highlights successfully in what government should look at is that there are all, as you say, all these strategies, all this legislation, but it's as if the left hand isn't really talking to the right, and it's about how do you make that all make sense so that you have the outcome. Now, on the point about genie back in the bottle, that's absolutely correct. We have social media, we have smartphones, we have people, children who are using them. So it really is about the governance of those products. Now, I wouldn't support a ban on smartphones because I think as a parent I'm also quite... I don't want to resist something that everybody else is participating in. I know it's really hard for parents, I don't have children of that age, to stop their children from having smartphones. But I think some governance around the kinds of things that they can see and perhaps age verification on certain things, I think would be important.
I mean, I think it's also, and I haven't experienced this directly with my children as far as I know, but I think it's also, I mean, this is a different debate, but it's also how fast social media companies are able to develop their algorithms. All homework is done online now. It is almost impossible to get a textbook and a piece of paper. It's not the way schools operate. And as soon as you're in that position, then there's a user using it, and suddenly the algorithm is throwing up all sorts of things. Thankfully, not that, but all sorts of things that I don't feel are appropriate for them to see. It's even bigger, I think, than just governance. It feels like the world is making that impossible, and if we think that's the problem, I think we're on to a loser. But it must be bigger than that, surely, the way to tackle it.
It has to be bigger than that. I mean, I personally feel that actually children, young people under the age of 16, you can get access to a phone, but you don't need all the features on it that actually lead children into the areas of information and content, which is, I think, really harmful, not just in this space, but other areas as well. But there is a massive bigger issue here about how we deal with violent crime. The fact is, you know, women who have been raped are waiting years to get it to court.
I'm so glad you brought that up.
Well, quite.
Right. I mean, we have a gallery of victims here. You know, I have friends and colleagues, right, despite the courts trying to do their very best under challenging circumstances, right? Not the judge's fault. Cases are being listed in 2026. You know, in 2023, nearly 70% of rape victims dropped out of investigations because of the trauma of going through the court process. The courts are underfunded. You've got to have a CPS that have got the resources once they've got the evidence, to bring the case. Unless that's dealt with seriously, the reality is that there's not going to be any deterrent, and the tragedy of the people, those women behind us, is going to continue, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. And it is about seeing justice being done, because just arresting someone and charging someone is just part of the process. I mean, we all know, and we've known it for as long as I've been, aware of this as a woman from a teenager, that to go to court, to raise your voice and say something like rape has happened to you or domestic violence is not easy. Yeah. And the longer the process takes, I think the harder it is. I mean, it's hard on one level for potentially the people being accused of this in remand, often in prisons and what have you, and what that's doing in terms of space. But, I mean, could you imagine, well, we can't imagine how awful it is, where you do step up and you say, this has happened, and then you're waiting years before you're able to actually stand in a court if you're brave enough to do that.
Your life is on hold,
and give the evidence. Your life is on hold. And it is about sort of seeing justice being done, and there is something in our system that,
so
policymakers and others need to get it right.
Is it complete lack of funding into the right places, either the criminal justice system or policing? Is it just a lack of... What is it like? It can't be a lack of will, surely.
I think there is a mixture between lack of funding and I think there's been chronic underfunding, and I would absolutely accept that from the Conservative tenure in government too, in the justice system. And I also think that we are now dealing with complex crimes in a way that a lot of police forces have not had to consider previously.
Explain what you mean by
so, the kind of casework that you've got to do, the way that you are dealing with people who have been victims of sexual violence and sexual assault, the kind of training that's required for that. Actually, you need very specialist skills to be able to handle that correctly. It's not the biggest issue, but it's one of the issues in terms of slowing down of cases. I think there's ways of collecting evidence as well that needs to improve for certain cases in order for the CPS to be able to bring charges.
That's just not the resources, the technical resources. I mean, look, by the time most people come to court nowadays, it's not eyewitnesses, right? It's computer evidence, DNA. That's what you're talking about. And all of that stuff is woefully underfunded. As I say, I have colleagues where cases have been dropped.
I totally agree.
Because the scientists aren't there, that the money isn't there.
I totally agree. And I think one of the issues is, for me, is that what does the government really want to prioritise? What is the job of the government? And, I've always been a firm believer, state, law and order, defence, it has to be the first priority of government.
Why didn't that happen under the Conservatives? Because it sounds like something that they would.
I totally accept that this is something that has been an issue. I think between 2010 and 2014, you saw instances of certain types of violent crime coming down.
Right.
And I think that there was an issue around austerity, reduction of the state, that then, when you saw violent crime started climbing back up, when you saw different instances of reporting, and let's not forget that actually people are reporting more of this crime, which is a good thing, that we are aware of the extent of this.
Unless they're brought to court and sentenced.
So,
Exactly. So the next point...
Can I just ask you, we've got Lisa Squire coming in. Now, she's a mum of a daughter who was murdered. One of the points that no doubt she will make is that it doesn't usually start with murder and rape. It starts with the other offences, upskirting, that sort of thing. And the sentences for that sort of thing are woefully inadequate. Where's the deterrent sentencing for that? Isn't that really what's important?
Pursued?
Sometimes they're pursued, and when they are, it's very unlikely you're going to get a custodial sentence. What message does that send out?
Or indeed, how we are tracking that data about particular offenders and how we use that data. Look, I would be very cautious about suggesting that the police are able to access particular kinds of data, but offending data and the way that you then see things come back up and people are noted for the crimes that they've committed previously. I think that's an important piece of what we need to do for preventative crime.
Look, I think that, our safety and security is one of the top... it always has been, I think, top 3 issues the public concerned about. And, I mean, look, there's no easy answers, but I do think... You're right, Rob, I think about resources to the courts, and we've seen a lot of courts being shut down around the country and over a number of years. But again, I think it's about, well, look, what are the priorities about what we do in courts? Are there issues around specific crimes, particularly violent crimes, where actually we have special courts that can actually meet round the clock to deal with some of these cases? I think that actually, you know, there is an issue around policing. We saw 20,000 police officers be lost from 2010 to 2015, and then it was backfilling later on after the 2019 general election. And that's the problem, is you're always backfilling. I would personally say, and I've felt this for a long time, the culture issue around our police forces as well is we have too many police forces across the country.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that about too many police officers. In Yorkshire, we've got at least 3 different police forces, 3 different chief constables, 3 different police and crime commissioners. And I have to say, if you're going to change the culture and utilise in a smart way all the resources you need to get people to court, the DNA evidence, why haven't we got one police force for Yorkshire?
But why would that help? Because the other flip argument is having smaller forces that are really aware of their patch in the community.
Totally. But what you want is a borough commander for every local authority area doing that local policing, Kate. But on the other level, in terms of the technicians you need, the people who can do the cyber stuff and everything else, why have we got, you know, payrolls across all these different police forces? Why have we got, you know, procurement of things across all these different police forces? It's local border borough commanders, but let's have the rest on a you know, on a bigger footprint, so we can really attack the culture.
And you've got Lincolnshire Police getting rid of 200 officers
at the same day.
But this is what's going to happen, is that you can... Look, reforming all the police, the service generally, and the police areas, yes, you can make back-office savings and things like that, but how does that actually impact, and how are people going to think about those efficiencies?
But it's strategic
It does
well.
go to the front line. But we do have strategic command in the sense of local mayoral authorities that are being expanded and are being expanded by this government too. So I think there is also a question about where does accountability sit. We've both worked in the Home Office. One of the things that gets me is that the Home Secretary actually does not have control of police forces and police officers. It has operational independence from politics, and that is correct. So where does the accountability truly sit about the way that crime is being pursued and the way that you take those strategic decisions?
But the idea is that police and crime commissioners, which were obviously created under the Conservatives, were going to be part of that accountability. And I think that's a good thing. But fundamentally, chief constables across these many different police forces, they have responsibility and accountability for their operational control and strategically deploying their resources across their areas. And I just think there are too many police forces. It's not going to solve everything on this. And if we could actually bring more together, we might utilise
But if you had one lab
better.
processing, using real, you know, childlike layman's language, you had one lab processing the DNA rather than many labs, that doesn't necessarily mean it would happen faster unless the lab was triple the size. You know, sometimes you can think of things being reduced and it doesn't necessarily lead to a better result.
Yeah, there isn't one lab in every police force area.
OK.
This is about the sort of, you know, the detectives, the homicide squads, the specialist units that deal with rape and other violence crime, actually, you know, as far as possible, trying to get that working together. And then the eyes on the ground are led by your borough commanders locally. But the bigger issue here is why in 2025, and I'm like 63, I'm feeling like the sort of things we're talking about now, we were talking about when I was a teenager. And the sort of problems of addressing this is about what is going on in our society and, you know, why so many men take opportunities to hurt women every single day.
Can I ask you about that culture? Obviously, the only man here. One of the things I remember not long ago, I got in a taxi with a friend of mine, not a black cab, and fell asleep. And we were going somewhere, and I woke up and my girlfriend next to me said, you know, I'd never do that.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought, what are you talking about? Now, for most men around London and major cities, we're having a totally different experience. I'd walk back in the dark on my own. Now, that's not to say I'm not likely to be a victim of violence. I have in the past, but it's trying to educate men about the lives and experiences of
to understand it.
Precisely. Now, that's education alongside deterrent policing and hard sentences, right? How do we go about making that cultural shift, as you said, really to enable people to understand and to help stop this absolute terrible scourge?
Well, there was just on that point of feeling threatened, sorry, not to interrupt you all, there was an extraordinary survey that said that having talked to women about their fears, they said they would rather be stuck in some woods in the dark with a bear than with a man. That is the level of fear. Yeah, that is the level of fear that women feel. Not all women, but it was shocking how many would pick that because that's the sense of fear that women feel.
Yeah, I mean, I was walking, you know, not necessarily a dangerous area, but walking back from somewhere. Actually, it was earlier this week, and it was one of those situations. I'm sure we've all been there, where it was dark, it was a bit rainy, and a man. Not that he was necessarily, you know, going to hurt me, but he came up pretty close behind me, walking. Now, I immediately, to be honest, crossed the road. I crossed the road because he was behind me, because I wanted to see what was going on. And I think women and girls, this is how we think. All
I mean, there are, of course, threats of violence to men as well.
Yeah.
And there's, of course, fear to men.
To be sure.
It's not as though this is exclusively the province.
There's a uniqueness, and that's what the National Audit Office report is talking about. There's a unique vulnerability for certain women, particularly, and it's not always strangers, it's not always opportunistic, sometimes in their own homes, and the people that are supposed to love them the most, that is where the threat and the danger comes from. And you have to try and understand, really, what are the drivers for that kind of behaviour. We can talk about sort of content on social media, but ultimately, how do you tackle something that's you know, difficult to harness, like a concept like misogyny, and where does that come from, and why does that lead women into fearful environments or a fearful state? Just to say that there are actually really helpful apps out there at the moment. Caroline, if you've got an issue like that, there's one called WalkSafe, that if you tap into it and you feel like you're being followed, it sends an alert out to everybody that, you know, to your contacts to let you know, and gives you a geolocator. So I would urge anybody who is worried about that, who is worried about being out by themselves, to look at some of these things to try and.
But it is sad to think that, you know, that we have to use an app on a night out and wake up all our friends with a worrying alert. You know what I mean? It's sad that we're in a world where this is necessary, but great to have the technology to help.
I would say as well, you know, I think you were making the point earlier about, you know, it doesn't start with the most serious violent crimes. Is, you know, there are some men out there who that is completely a journey on to becoming the most serious violent criminals. But there's also some young men, boys, who are getting involved in stuff, sharing photos, all of that sort of thing. We need to nip that in the bud. I mean, I'm not saying it's criminal for those teenagers, but we need to have a scheme where actually there is an engagement with that young boy and young man about what that means, how that will impact. I'm not saying that's going to solve everything, but if we don't have those serious conversations with those kids early on, it can lead into something worse.
You know, sometimes, you know, any programme is accused of exaggerating, right? And so it's important to have the actual numbers. You know, when we raise this topic, it's always surprising to me, especially on social media, how many people say you're overstating the case. Just give you some numbers here. In the period between 23 and 24, incidents of rape and sexual assaults against women and girls recorded by the police rose, get this, from 34,000 to 123,000. Now, that might be partly explained because of better recording of the data, but that's a shocking
That's incredible
number,
figures.
Right?
Incredible figures. I mean, I think you're always careful, I think, in sort of politics about using certain phrases, but epidemic has been used in this area. And it is all about the multiple forms it takes. As Salma said, you know, that women face often the greatest violence from someone they know, someone they trust. And those sort of figures, whilst you can always say people might be reporting more and what have you, there is something seriously going on in our society that is not right.
Now, that's another element that you bring up, and that's certainly my experience, both prosecuting, especially defending in those cases, that actually, in most cases of violence against women, it takes place in the home. Another issue which hasn't adequately been dealt with or tackled, right?
Yeah, but this is also kind of a misogyny of the system that is also now coming out, which is the way that women and these kinds of crimes historically have been treated. I think one of the things that is important to recognise, and for anyone who's been a victim of this kind of crime, is that consent is important, and ensuring that you are not going to be dismissed when you go into establishment environments. But in terms of the numbers, I mean, you know, is there going to be more data commissioned anywhere on why these types of crime is actually rising? Because until we try and understand the motivations, how are we going to get to the root to try and solve it?
Right. And adequate safe spaces, right, for women to get to. Right, and for quality information of where those places are in the event that they're experiencing violence in the home. As you rightly say, it doesn't start, right, with explosive murder. It starts one step at a time, right? And, you know, I've dealt with those cases, and what you see is that at some moment, if somebody had intervened, if there'd been a police officer available, for instance, that had taken the issue seriously, that person would be alive today, right?
Yeah.
Now, I mean, on that note, I was going to, just because I'm interested...
I think we got the same thread.
Yeah, did we really?
I
OK.
think so, yeah,
you take
go for it.
You know, I'm interested because it's obviously friends who now have are judges and colleagues. Sarah Sharif.
I mean, it's not unrelated,
No.
actually. Not unrelated, is it? But,
a terrible case of a child tortured and murdered. And as you'll be aware, the judge the judge is, in fact, who oversaw the family proceedings that led to Sarah being returned to her family, they weren't named at first by the judge, right? There was an application that was made and the judge said, we're not going to name those judges because I'm concerned that there'll be a witch hunt against them. That was overruled by a senior judge who said, well, I'm afraid that's part of freedom, that we should know who the judges are and why, what reasons there were for returning Sarah back to her family. The names of those judges, I think, are going to be published today. I have to say, I'm very concerned about their safety and the reasons why people want to know the names of the judges. Can you understand why, sir?
Yes, I understand why. I have a lot of sympathy for the judges in the case. This wouldn't have been an easy decision to have made. I think the only thing that I would say is that people should hear what the judgment was and why that judgment came to be with an impartial ear, because that's not necessarily what happened tragically is not necessarily something that the judge would have assumed would have taken place, and the assurances that a court would have sought about the placement of a child, however horrific that and tragic that end came to be. But I do think it's important that justice is seen to be done, and the way and the process of that has to be transparent, because if there's anything that the last decade has taught us is that accountability matters and accountability is diminishing.
There's always been I think, question about just how, particularly in the family courts, it is open to the public there, because you're dealing with very complex situations involving families, and there's protection of the identities of the children themselves. I think in this case that actually it is important that we know about the judges. I hear your point, Rob, about the threats to them, but in some ways the fact that it has been stifled who they are has probably added to the sort of environment.
Well, that's what the appeal judge said. He said, actually, this is exactly what's going to happen. People are going to be more concerned, exactly as you've described.
As though there was something to cover up.
Exactly.
Yeah. But and I have to think, I think it was Jeffrey Voss.
Jeffrey Voss, yeah.
Thank you. He was pretty
scathing.
damning, scathing,
yeah.
About the rationale for suppressing their identity.
Well, the judge at first didn't hear any evidence.
Yeah,
exactly. That's the point.
And that there was sort of maybe, I don't know, but the thing is that about this case, from what I understand, and you know, we'll probably find out more actually once this is all being reported on with these judges. You know, Surrey County Court had made Surrey County Council had made representations about evidence of violence within this family home, not only affecting older siblings as well. And I think there is a question to answer about how could that be dismissed and this child end up being continued to be placed in the care of someone for whom it was known, not only domestic violence,
don't know what
but also other coercive control and violence against children. So I think justice has to be seen to be done, and this is what we were talking about earlier.
Well, justice has to be done, not just seen to be done.
But those accountable, yeah, exactly.
But I guess the problem is that you don't know what evidence was presented to that judge, and you don't know how many gaps. The argument might be in the system from the, you know, the child, she told another child at school that she was having problems, and they then apparently told parents and other people, and things didn't get reported. How many gaps? And I suppose the concern is that it ends up with a judge who's looking at a selection of evidence very carefully in a considered way, and suddenly finds himself, you know, absolutely...
But this is entirely the point, that if you reveal the name of the judge... the judges in this case, then we need to take a step back and actually understand how that process came to be. And if there are gaps, then we need to work out why there were gaps.
Some people don't do that. That's not going to be the headline. You know, just as well as I.
Look, I understand
these judges, right, family judges, have to make the hardest calls imaginable.
Of course.
They are absolutely, I mean, sometimes emotionally terrifying, where the decision is based on one simple test, right? What is the safety of the child? That child has a lawyer appointed by the state correctly just to represent that child. All the evidence is heard, and that lawyer will go home, and the next day she'll come to court and make a decision about whether or not it's safe to return that child. Just as it's... by the way, magistrates who aren't qualified judges make decisions on whether or not somebody should have bail. They do so to the best of their skill and on the evidence that's in front of them. That's not what's going to happen. People are going to... You understand what's going to happen?
I understand what's going to happen. There's going to be salacious headlines that are going to damn these judges and say that you got it wrong, you made a mistake that cost somebody their life. I understand that. Emotions are going to be high, understandably, about a case as horrific as this, because, you know, there's nobody that doesn't feel empathy towards the victim here.
And these are not politically appointed judges like in America.
And I'm not saying that I don't think that's going to happen, but this is why we have a platform today to issue a plea to say, please look carefully at the decisions that they have to make, the evidence that was put in front of them, and let's ask ourselves how we make this process better.
But by the same token, when it comes to safeguarding cases, lots of other people involved, those who work for local authorities who have a role in this, they're not often protected in terms of anonymity, because it's felt it's actually important that we know what evidence they presented, what safeguarding they did. So I don't believe, and although I'm conscious of what you're saying about, you know, we don't want people just sort of vigilante type of sort of reactions to this, but I do think there's an accountability, and the fact there is going to be an inquiry into the whole matter, whether you're a judge or a social worker, I'm afraid, you know, you deserve protection from anything that is harmful to yourself in terms of reprisals, absolutely, but you have to be, they have to be known and they have to account.